Miss Lydia Mercer was asked to leave the supper table at Verne Hall in front of 52 assembled guests, and she did so with a composure that ought to have warned every soul in that room. Exactly 14 minutes before Field Marshal Lord Kingsley entered through the east corridor doors and stopped walking the instant he saw the silver cross pinned to her grey gown. I want you to sit with both halves of that sentence, my dear friends, the dismissal and the recognition. 52 witnesses to the first and 52 struck silent by the second, because the whole of tonight's story lives in the space between those 14 minutes, and I mean to take you through every one of them before this fire burns low. Let me give you the dismissal first, since it came first, and since Lady Caverton arranged it with the particular care of a woman who considers humiliation an art form. The supper at the Victory Gala had been called at 10:30. Verne Hall was the grandest house in the county, and its hosts were determined to celebrate the war's end accordingly, with candlelight and silver that had spent 2 years in storage and was now very pleased to be back on a table. The guests flowed from the ballroom into the long dining room in a shimmer of silk and dark broadcloth, finding their seats among orchids and enough crystal to make a field spittle weep. Miss Lydia Mercer, who had come to the gala as companion to the elderly dowager Countess of Arlen, had seen her frail employer settled comfortably among the senior guests, and had then been directed by a harried footman, misreading the seating chart in the candlelight, to an open chair near the end of the second table. She was tired. She had been on her feet since 7. She sat down. She had been seated perhaps 2 minutes when Lady Caverton noticed her. You will find a Lady Caverton in every room that has ever assembled for the purpose of congratulating itself. Handsome, self-certain, and possessed of a social instinct, so finely tuned it could locate an irregularity at 40 paces. She had marked Miss Mercer earlier in the evening, the plain grey silk among the satins, the quiet way she moved, the manner in which she fetched the old countess's shawl and held her fan, and had filed her with the swift efficiency of long practice under help. And now the help was seated at the supper table as though she belonged there. "I beg your pardon," said Lady Caverton. Her voice was pitched with great care to carry from one end of a long dining room to the other without appearing to be raised. "I believe there may be some confusion. This table is laid for Lord Verne's guests." A pause. She let it do its work. Let 52 faces turn. Let the silver stop against the china. Companions and attendants are given their supper in the east sitting room. One of the footmen can show you the way, I'm quite sure. A gentleman near the centrepiece, a colonel who had done his celebrating rather thoroughly by that point in the evening, remarked, not quite under his breath, that the girl had probably never seen silver laid out like this, and could hardly be blamed for wanting a look at it. And Lydia Mercer, 25 years old, who had in the past 2 years done things that not one person at that table could have endured for a single month, rose from her chair without a word. She did not flush. She did not tremble. She inclined her head toward Lady Caverton with the particular courtesy of someone who has faced far worse than this and found it manageable, and she walked the full length of that dining room. Past 52 guests, past the orchids, past the colonel with wine in his cheeks, and she took up a position near the wall beside the east corridor door, where she could be found if the countess needed her, and where the candlelight fell, as it happened, in a long warm column directly onto the small silver cross, pinned at her breast on a ribbon of deep crimson. It was the single decoration she owned, the only ornament she had ever thought worth keeping. 14 minutes later, Field Marshal Lord Kingsley, who had been taking his supper privately with Lord Verne and the regimental commanders, as was his custom, came through to make the ceremonial round of the room. The whole dining hall rose, and Lord Kingsley, moving slowly along the corridor on the arm of his host, passed the east door where a young woman in grey stood alone against the wall, and stopped. The room watched him stop. The room watched him look, a long, still moment, at the silver cross on its crimson ribbon. And then the room heard him, in the unhurried voice of a man who has spent 40 years making himself heard over cannon fire, ask the question that brings us all here to this fire tonight. "Lord Verne," said Field Marshal Lord Kingsley, "there is a young woman standing by your door who wears the Silver Cross of Service. I have presented that decoration to 11 people in 30 years of active command. I wonder if you would be good enough to tell me why the holder of one of them is standing against your wall while the rest of the county sits at your table. And I am going to stop us right there. Right there, with 52 forks frozen in the air, and Lady Caverton's face beginning its journey toward a colour I can only describe as publicly accountable, and a physician's daughter in grey silk standing very still in a column of candlelight, while a field marshal waits for an answer that no one in that room can give him. Before I tell you what that cross was for, and what Lydia Mercer did to earn it, and who else in that glittering room had reason to go pale at the sight of it, you and I have something to take care of. If you have been sitting by this fire with me and have not yet subscribed to Moonlight at Marlowe, do it now. It takes 10 seconds and costs you nothing, and it means the next story comes straight to you the moment I have it ready. Go on. I will wait. Now come back with me. Not 14 minutes, but 2 years, to a season this county would prefer to forget entirely. Let me show you what a physician's daughter can do when the dying start to outnumber the living. Lydia Mercer was the only child of Dr. Samuel Mercer, a field surgeon who had spent 30 years attached to various regiments, and who had the particular gift, rare in any profession, of being genuinely useful rather than merely credentialed. He had taken Lydia on his rounds from the time she could keep quiet beside him, and by 12 she was cataloguing medicines and rolling bandages with the efficiency of someone twice her age. By 17 she was managing his supply requisitions, keeping his field notes and running the administrative half of an operation that moved with the regiment from posting to posting. She had, her father used to say with the dry affection that passed between them for sentiment, the two gifts that medicine actually runs on, and neither of them is the one the colleges bother to teach. The first was a clear head in the presence of chaos, not courage, which is something else entirely and much easier to come by. Clarity. The ability to walk into a room full of suffering and see not the suffering first, but the order, what must happen, in which sequence, by whose hands and why. The second was what he called the organizing gift. The ability to look at 100 things that need doing and 10 people to do them, and assign the work so precisely that all 100 things somehow get done. She was 23 when the Northern Campaign began to go wrong. You may not know the full shape of it unless you've read the histories, and most people haven't. It isn't the sort of history that gets told at Victory Galas. The supply lines broke down in the month. The medical corps was undersized to begin with and was halved by dysentery before the autumn. The field hospitals were overcrowded, undersupplied, and understaffed in ways that the dispatches sent home made sound like administrative inconveniences, and that were, in actual fact, catastrophic. The crisis came in January of the second year, when a fever swept through the eastern camp with a speed that collapsed the already failing system within a week. The field surgeons were overwhelmed. The orderlies were frightened and untrained. The supply of clean linen had run out, and the men who should have been replacing it were themselves sick. Lydia looked at the chaos the way she had always looked at difficult things, clearly and without the luxury of panic, and she saw the order hiding inside it. She went to the regimental quartermaster, who was a frightened man very glad to be told what to do by anyone who sounded like they knew, and within 48 hours the largest tent in the eastern camp had been converted into an organized ward of 60 beds, working on a rotation of orderlies in 4-hour watches, supplied by a line for clean water and fuel. She had negotiated herself by writing 3 letters in one afternoon to supply officers who had previously considered themselves too senior to receive correspondence from a surgeon's daughter. She recruited her nursing corps from the camp followers and the regimental wives, not the ones who volunteered first, because those were often motivated by sentiment, which is a fine thing in peacetime and a liability in a ward. She chose the steady ones, the practical ones, the women already acquainted with hard work and loss. She trained them herself in the plain rules her father had drilled into her since childhood: cleanliness, fresh air, the boiling of linen, the strict separation of the fevered from the healing. She kept the records. Every admission, every discharge, every death, every delivery. All of it logged in her own clear hand in a series of field notebooks that would later become, to the medical board's considerable astonishment, the most complete documentation of wartime nursing care they had ever reviewed. The system held. That is the thing I want you to understand, and I want you to understand it plainly, because it is not the kind of heroism that makes it into the dispatches. Nobody's single brilliant act saved the Eastern camp that January. What saved it was a system, relentless, unglamorous, and built from nothing by a young woman the army had no official category for. Who did the work because no one else was doing it, and because she had inherited from her father the incurable habit of seeing what needed to be done and doing it. It was into the worst week of the crisis that Lord Ashton Bryce arrived. He was 31 that winter, and he came north as a parliamentary observer. The kind of role that sounds more purposeful than it is, and that usually amounts to a man of standing watching things unfold while composing careful notes for people who are also not doing anything. He had been in London when the fever reports reached the capital, and, I will give him this plainly, because it is the foundation of everything he later became to Lydia, he got on a horse and rode north. This distinguished him from approximately every other man of his class and position who received those same reports that week. He arrived at the East Camp expecting to observe. He was met at the entrance of the fever tent by a young woman in a grey apron, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a manifest and a lamp, who looked him over once, took in his name and rank with a single nod, and said, in the tone of a commanding officer, receiving one more able-bodied recruit, with 17 things still left to do before nightfall. Lord Bryce, we're 14 blankets short on the north row. The supply wagon from the 2nd Regiment should have them. It's at the Eastern Depot. Can you ride? Lord Ashton Bryce, who had never in his life been given a task by anyone who did not outrank him, looked past her at the ward she had built. 60 beds, orderlies moving in practiced rotations, the whole impossible machinery of it running in the middle of a January freeze, and said, without hesitation, "I can ride." He came back with the blankets before dark. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He spent 6 weeks in the East Camp working inside Lydia Mercer's system, doing whatever the system needed, deploying his rank precisely as she directed it. At the supply officers, who ignored her letters when she sent them, but could not afford to ignore a parliamentary observer standing in their doorway. At the quartermaster's office, at the regimental command, who kept trying to reassign her nurses to kitchen duty. She did the talking. That was their arrangement, established within the first week and never explicitly discussed. He provided the architecture of rank she didn't have. She provided the knowledge, the direction, and the plan. I will give you one scene from those 6 weeks, because it is the scene that settled something permanent in him, and because it does not look, from the outside, like a romantic moment at all. There was a supply officer in the northern depot, a man named Pryor, who had been holding back a shipment of medical spirits on paperwork grounds that were either genuine or convenient. And Lydia had decided, after 2 letters and 1 wasted afternoon, that they were convenient. She arrived at his office one morning with Lord Bryce at her shoulder, and she laid out the situation plainly, and Pryor, addressing himself entirely to Lord Bryce as though she were not present, began to explain what the proper requisition process required. Lord Bryce said the only words he spoke in that office, "You are talking to the wrong person, Mr. Pryor. I am here to carry crates." Prior looked from the lord to the physician's daughter and back, and performed in his head the arithmetic of a man calculating what it might cost him to be known across 3 depots as the officer a parliamentary lord had carried crates against, and released the shipment before noon. Lord Bryce carried the first crate to the wagon himself, and Lydia told him on the road back that it was the most efficient use of rank she had ever witnessed, and he said it was certainly the most useful thing this particular lord had done in his career to date. And they laughed together in the cold, 2 exhausted people on a supply wagon, and the unmistakable air of a woman, and if you had passed them on that road, you would not have guessed you were looking at the beginning of something that would take 2 years and considerable expense to properly resolve. He discovered, somewhere in those 6 weeks, 2 things that rearranged the interior of his life. The first was the plain satisfaction of being genuinely useful, which no one had ever actually required of him before, the world not being in the habit of requiring that of men in his position. The second was Lydia Mercer. The moment that finished him entirely came in February in the 5th week, when Dr. Samuel Mercer, who had worked beside his daughter through the whole of the crisis, took the fever himself at last, and died of it in 4 days in a private corner of the very ward she had built, with her hand in his. Lord Bryce arrived the morning after. He had come prepared to find the system faltering. Grief does that, he had seen it, and had come, if he was honest, partly prepared to steady things. He found Lydia Mercer at the ward entrance at 6 in the morning. In her grey apron, her face like something carved from a harder substance than the rest of her, her eyes red-rimmed and dry, assigning the day's rotation in a clear and steady voice because there were 53 men in the beds behind her and no one else within 20 miles who knew how to keep them alive. He stood in the doorway. He did not step forward to take charge because there was nothing to take charge of. The system was running. She had not let it stop. She told him later that grief was a thing she would get to when the ward closed. That winter it was not something she could afford. He said afterward, to the one person he ever told the full story, that he had arrived at the Eastern camp believing courage was what he had witnessed in men under fire. He left knowing that the most courageous thing he had ever seen in his life was a young woman who buried her father in the morning and took the noon watch 2 hours late because the work required it, and she was the one who knew how to do it. The campaign ended in March. The system was dismantled. The nurses dispersed. The records went into regimental archives under headings that mentioned no one by name. The remarkable machine Lydia Mercer had built in a blizzard was quietly taken apart, and what it had accomplished was recorded in the language of institutions, which is to say, accurately but anonymously. They had one conversation before they parted, and I will give it to you honestly, because everything that went wrong afterward grew from what was left unsaid in it. He said he must return to London, which was true. There were committee obligations that had waited 6 weeks. He said he would write. He said, haltingly, that he hoped, when things had settled, that she might allow him to call on her properly. And Lydia, who was closing a hospital and burying a father, heard the shape of what he was not quite saying, and did not trust it. Not because she doubted him particularly, but because she was a physician's daughter, with a clear head and enough experience of the world to know what generally became of feelings formed in extraordinary circumstances. Once the circumstances returned to ordinary, she said she would be glad to receive him. She meant it. They shook hands at the entrance to the dismantled ward, like colleagues, which they were, and like 2 people who had not said the real thing, which they also were. And both believed there would be time. There was not time. Her father's estate, it emerged, was what a country surgeon's estate usually is, the accounts of a man who had spent 30 years billing patients who could not pay and never once minding about it. There was nothing left after the debts were settled. Lydia sold what could be sold, paid what could be paid, and found herself at 24 with exactly 1 marketable gift and exactly 1 respectable market for it. she accepted a position with the Dowager Countess of Arlen through her father's old connections, packed 2 trunks and her field notebooks, and moved south. The letter she wrote to Lord Bryce, explaining her change of circumstances, arrived at his London address. The same week he departed for the continent on parliamentary business that expanded, as such business does, into something considerably longer than anyone had planned. The letter followed him through 3 forwarding addresses. It did not catch him. He came back to England 7 months later to find Dr. Mercer's house sold, the practice dispersed, and no Lydia Mercer in any directory that mattered. A woman who had managed a wartime hospital had vanished from the public record as completely as if she had never been there. Which was, he discovered, because the records had never quite included her to begin with. A companion travels under her employer's name, in her employer's carriage, to her employer's engagements. She is written down nowhere at all. He searched. I want you to know that, because it matters to what came after. He searched for the better part of 4 months by every means available to a man who refuses to set runners on a woman he respects, and the plain truth kept to of a woman that kept him awake at night was that the person who had saved the Eastern camp had disappeared from England's accounting more thoroughly than a deserter, because the records had never thought to keep her in the first place. Now I must give you the medal, because you have nearly caught up to the Victory Gala, and you cannot understand what Lord Kingsley saw from the East Corridor door without knowing exactly what the Silver Cross of Service was. The Regimental Medical Board had reviewed the records of the Eastern camp 6 months after the campaign ended, because a junior physician had thought to ask a simple question: why was the East camp's mortality rate from the January fever less than 1/3 of every comparable camp's? The answer was in Lydia's notebooks. The notebooks went to the board. The board sent them to the Surgeon General. The Surgeon General sent a summary to the Field Marshal. Lord Kingsley, who held to the old-fashioned view that the person responsible for a result ought to be identified by name, made his own inquiries. He read the notebooks. He interviewed orderlies and nurses who had served in the East camp, and at a quiet ceremony that autumn, attended by no one the newspapers considered worth mentioning, he presented Miss Lydia Mercer with the Silver Cross of Service, and told her, holding her hand a moment longer than ceremony required, that she had done the work of a quartermaster, a physician, and a commanding general simultaneously, and that the army's debt to her was one its institutional character made it poorly equipped to repay, but that wearing the cross was at least a beginning. She went back to the Countess of Arlen the same week. The notice in the newspaper had run 2 lines. No one she encountered in the months that followed had read them. She wore the medal because he had asked her to. She wore it partly in memory of her father, whose work it honored as much as hers, and she wore it, I think, though she would have worded this differently, as the one piece of evidence she carried that said, against the daily evidence of her own invisibility, that she had once been truly seen, not as a companion, not as someone's daughter, as herself. She was wearing it on the evening the Dowager Countess of Arlen, who loved Lydia, and who had insisted on both her attendance at the Victory Gala and the wearing of the cross, with an uncharacteristic firmness that Lydia had not fully understood until much later, brought her companion to Verne Hall, into a supper-room containing Lady Caverton, Field Marshal Lord Kingsley, and Lord Ashton Bryce. Now you have everything. Come back with me to the East Corridor door, where a young woman is standing very still, and a field marshal's question is hanging in the silence of a room where 52 forks have not moved. Lord Verne, who had spent the entire evening attending to his royal guest and knew nothing of the supper-room's earlier cruelty, could offer the field marshal no answer, and said so with the honesty of a genuinely embarrassed host. Lord Kingsley looked down the length of the dining table. He had spent 4 decades reading rooms under fire. He saw Lady Caverton's too correct posture, the wine untouched before her, the particular quality of stillness, in a room full of people watching someone else be held responsible. He understood, I have no doubt, the precise shape of what had occurred before his arrival, in every detail but the names. He did not address it directly. He did something more considered. He crossed the remaining distance to the young woman by the door. The whole room rose and rustled around him, and he reached Lydia and said, in a voice that was warm and entirely unhurried, and that reached every corner of that dining room, without the smallest apparent effort. Miss Mercer, I remember you very well, and I remember exactly what this cross was given for. I see that you have worn it as I asked. He offered his arm. I find I am in want of a conversation with someone who has actually accomplished something, and the company at the formal table has grown rather ceremonial this evening. Will you come and sit with me? I want to hear what has become of you since the Eastern camp. She curtsied. A proper curtsy, the one her mother had taught her before her mother was gone, and she took his arm. And Field Marshal Lord Kingsley led Miss Lydia Mercer down the full length of that supper table, past the orchids and the crystal, past the colonel, past Lady Caverton, upon whom he did not bestow the smallest fraction of his attention, which those present would agree was the most efficient social verdict the county had witnessed since the war ended, and through the doors of the private dining room which closed behind them. The silence in the main room lasted a full quarter-minute. It was broken by the Dowager Countess of Arlen, 83 years old, who set down her hair champagne glass, looked down the length of the table, with the serenity of a woman who has been waiting all evening, and has just received a finer outcome than she dared plan for, and said to no one in particular, I did suggest she wear it. But it is not the private dining room I want to take you into, my dear friends, because what passed between Lydia and the Field Marshal belongs to the two of them. It is the ballroom afterward, because standing at the far edge of that ballroom when the doors opened an hour later, having arrived late from London to an event, he very nearly did not attend, having heard within 5 minutes of his arrival the account that was already moving through the room, like fire in dry grass, stood a tall man of 33, very still, with a face that had gone the particular color of someone who has received news they had stopped expecting to receive. Lord Ashton Bryce had spent 4 months looking for her. He had spent the month since making what peace he could with the belief that she was beyond finding, and now she was crossing a ballroom toward him, alive and composed, in a grey gown he recognized, with the silver cross at her breast and the same steadiness in her face that he had watched hold a ward together through the worst February the Northern Territories had on record. He did not rush to her. That matters, so I want you to notice it. He understood, even in the first vertigo of seeing her, that the evening was hers, and that a man who truly respected her would not spend the most public hour of her life making it about his own astonishment. He waited until the sudden crowd of newly attentive guests, the very same people who had watched her walked to the wall, now maneuvering for introductions with a cheerful shamelessness that would have been funny in a different context, had thinned. He waited until she stood for a moment near the tall windows at the ballroom's end, catching her breath in the cold air off the glass. And then he crossed the floor and stopped and said, in a voice that did not quite manage to stay level, Miss Mercer, I have been looking for you for 4 months. The room tilted. She turned. And I will not pretend to you that the composure which had survived Lady Caverton, which had survived the Field Marshal's dining room entire, survived the sight of Lord Bryce's face 6 feet from hers, because it did not. The 2 years folded. She was standing in a ballroom, and she was simultaneously standing at the entrance to a dismantled tent ward in March, shaking this man's hand at the door, because neither of them had found the words for anything truer. Both of them believing there would be another chance. She mastered it. Mastering things was her particular genius. But he saw it. He had always seen her. It was the first thing she had noticed about him at the depot door, that he looked at her and saw not a surgeon's daughter giving him instructions, but the actual person behind the instructions, and found her worth looking at. "You were supposed to be in London," she said. "I was in London," he said, "and Brussels after that, and then back. I spent a great deal of my time in both places, writing to everyone connected to your father, trying to learn where you had gone." A pause. "Your letter missed me by 4 days. It followed me through 3 postal offices and was lost somewhere in the crossing. I came home in November to find your father's house sold and no forwarding address for you anywhere that I could locate. Which is, I want you to understand this, a thing I intend to be angry about for the rest of my life, on behalf of every woman it has ever happened to. That the people who do the most essential work are the ones the record never bothers to keep. I didn't know you were searching." "I know you didn't." He steadied himself. "That is precisely the problem." And what came next came out with the plainness of something held back 4 months and finally released all at once. "I am not going to make my peace with losing track of you again. I loved you at the entrance to that ward. I knew it when you handed me a blanket list and sent me to the depot without one word of explanation, and I went without a second thought, which is not something I have done for anyone. I loved you through 4 months of looking and not finding, and I have just watched a field marshal walk you past the length of the supper table that ordered you away from it, and I find that the only thing I want in this entire room is to never again be in a different city from you." He took a breath. "Marry me, Lydia. I should have said it at the camp. I'm saying it now. And here, my dear friends, is where this story becomes the story I actually came to tell you tonight." Because Lydia Mercer looked at the man she had loved in silence for 2 years, who was offering her in one sentence the end of every hardship. The companion's wage, the borrowed carriages, the long walk to the wall by someone else's supper table, and she said, "No, Lord Bryce, not tonight. And I need you to hear all of why, because the why matters more than the no." She said it quietly, near the tall, cold windows, the music carrying on somewhere behind them. And she said the thing she had been composing, without knowing it, since the morning she had entered her father's death in the camp log and kept the ward running. "3 hours ago," she said, "I was asked to leave a supper table because this room looked at a grey dress and a companion's manner and decided I was the help. Not one person at that table said a word." She looked at him steadily, and then a field marshal walked through the door, and now I have been introduced to half those same people who are very eager to know me. Do you see what that teaches me? It teaches me that this world does not see a woman. It sees the light falling on her, and it calls the light the woman. An hour ago, the light on me was an old countess's carriage. Now it is a field marshal's arm, and if I take your arm tonight, tomorrow the light will be yours, and I will spend the rest of my life being the woman. Lord Bryce lifted up, the companion who caught the right man's eye at the right gala, and every hour I spent in the Eastern camp, every watch rotation, every supply letter, every name in those notebooks that is alive because of a system I built from nothing, all of it, will shrink down to the charming prologue to the only fact about me that anyone will remember, which is that a lord of consequence wanted me, and I was grateful enough to say yes." She drew a breath, and her voice, which had been steady through everything, was very nearly not steady now. "And the unbearable part is that I love you. I have loved you, since you took a blanket list from a stranger at a tent door and rode to the depot in a freeze without one word about your rank. If I didn't love you, I could marry you tonight with a clear conscience and let the world make whatever story amused it. It is because I love you that I cannot let the truest thing in my life become the moral of a story about a woman who was patient and quiet long enough to be noticed by the right person." She met his eyes. "I was handed back my own name tonight, in front of this whole county. I will not trade it away in the same evening, not even for a better one, not even for yours." The silence between them lasted long enough for the music to change. Lord Ashton Bryce looked at the woman who had just refused him for the most extraordinary reason a man has ever been refused, and he did the thing that proved, more completely than the blanket run, more completely than 6 weeks of errands and carrying crates, that he was exactly the man she had taken him to be. He did not argue. He did not plead. He stood with the refusal, turning it over the way she had once watched him stand with a supply officer's obstinance, patiently, until he understood it from the inside. And then he said, slowly, "You're right. I asked you at the one moment when saying yes would cost you everything you've built, and I called it love, and it was love. But it was also a man reaching for the thing he wants at the exact moment when the world has just made it hardest for anyone to see her clearly. I didn't see that until you said it. Which doesn't surprise me, because you have seen everything more clearly than I have since the door of that ward." He paused. "Tell me what the honest version looks like, what needs doing, and in what order. You have some experience giving me direction. I have some experience following it." For the first time in that entire extraordinary evening, Lydia Mercer laughed. The real one, the one he had heard 4 times across 6 weeks of a brutal winter and had spent 4 months not hearing. "What needs doing," she said, "is the thing I have been carrying in my head since the camp closed. The Eastern Ward worked because I could build a system fast, from nothing, in a crisis. But the next crisis will not wait for someone to improvise it again from scratch. Every next winter, every next fever, every district in the north will reinvent the wheel the hard way, and most of them will fail, because there will be no assembly of trained hands already waiting. What needs doing is a permanent institution, a school for nurses, trained properly before the emergency, with standards and a curriculum and a placement corps kept in readiness. I have had the full design in my head for 2 years, down to the last budget line. I have had nothing but a companion's wage to build it with." "Then here is my answer to your refusal," said Lord Ashton Bryce. "I will fund it, the full cost, settled irrevocably, on one condition, which is that your name goes on the building and mine does not. The Mercer Institute for Nursing, directed by Miss Lydia Mercer, at a salary appropriate to its director, with a governing board of her own choosing that I have no seat on. In 2 years you will be the most consequential voice in nursing care in the north of England, by your own work, owing me nothing that the deed of endowment doesn't discharge on its first day. And when that is done, when the light falling on you is entirely yours, from a source no one in this country can mistake, I will come and ask my question again between 2 people who have each built something real, and you may give me whatever answer is true." She took the offer. I hope you never doubted she would, because it was, if you look at it squarely, the only offer anyone had ever made her that asked nothing back. And Lydia Mercer had spent her whole working life knowing the difference between a gift and a purchase, down to the last penny. The deed was drawn that spring by lawyers who later admitted they had never settled money on stranger terms. The Mercer Institute opened in the northern quarter the following autumn, in a plain stone building, 2 streets from the Army Depot, where she had once stood arguing for a shipment of medical spirits, and Lydia Mercer went north to run it. I will not draw the 2 years of it out for you, because you can imagine the shape, the curriculum, the supply systems, the careful documentation of everything, the work done in peacetime, so that it would hold when peace ended. What I will tell you is that when a fever moved through the mill district in the second winter, it met, for the first time in that county's history, a trained nursing corps already in place and waiting for it, and it was contained in 5 weeks with a loss of life so low that the medical journals wrote it up at length and attributed it, by name, to the Mercer Institute and its director, Field Marshal Lord Kingsley, who had not retired as expected and who read the journals, sent a personal note. He said the Eastern Camp notebooks had been the right thing to act on, and that he was sorry it had taken the army as long as it had to notice them. And in the spring of the 2nd year, a carriage arrived from London, and Lord Ashton Bryce was announced at the Mercer Institute, and was made to wait 22 minutes in the reception hall, because the director was finishing her quarterly review with her board, and the board's time was not to be trifled with. He sat in the hall in his good coat with his hat on his knee, being examined with frank curiosity by a row of nursing students, and he waited with the patience of a man who has learned, through practice, that certain things are worth waiting for. When Lydia came out to him, in her grey linen, in her own building, under the light of a life that was entirely and unmistakably hers, he rose and said, "Miss Mercer, I have an appointment 2 years standing. I've come to ask my question, as I promised, between two people who have each built something real." "Ask it," she said. "Marry me," said Lord Ashton Bryce. "Not to raise you up. You stand higher in this county than I do, and you have earned every inch of it. Not to rescue you. You draw a director's salary I negotiated specifically so it would leave you nothing that needed rescuing. I ask because I loved you at the entrance to a fever tent before either of us had anything but the work, and I love you now that you have everything that matters. And the only change 2 years have made is that now when the world tells the story of us, there is no version of it in which you are the one who was lucky. Marry me, Lydia, and let whatever light falls on us fall on us both." She looked at the man who had heard the strangest refusal ever spoken in an English ballroom and answered it by spending 2 years and a building and a deed of endowment, making her a life in which her yes would mean something. "Yes," she said, "between two people who have each built something real. Yes." They were married that summer in the church where her father was buried, and half the county came, and the full staff of the Mercer Institute lined the churchyard path in their grey and white uniforms, which made the bride cry in a way that no cathedral in England could have managed. She wore exactly one ornament. You already know which one. I must, before I let this story close, settle one small account I left open. For you may have wondered, as Lydia eventually wondered, why the Dowager Countess of Arlen had insisted with such uncharacteristic firmness on both the attendance at the gala and the wearing of the cross. The Countess confessed it at the wedding breakfast, over her second glass of champagne, with the undisguised satisfaction of a woman who has been planning something for 3 months and is now watching it succeed beyond her expectations. She had known, she said, that Lord Kingsley would be at Verne Hall. Her late husband's connections with the regimental command went back 40 years, and she had learned of it well in advance. She had looked at her quiet grey companion, whom the room walked past 100 times a week without seeing, and she had thought of 2 lines in a newspaper that nobody had read, and a silver cross in a jewellery box, and she had made what she called, with great serenity, a small arrangement. "I could not make this county see you, my dear," she told the bride, patting her hand. "I am 83 years old, and I have very little left in the way of direct authority, but I could make certain you were standing in the right room, wearing the right evidence when someone arrived who could." She raised her glass. "Lord Kingsley did the rest, and did it rather better than I had dared hope. Never let anyone tell you that old women are past usefulness. We are simply obliged to work through circumstances instead of force, which requires considerably more patience, and, I will admit, considerably more cunning. As for Lady Caverton, history records one final account, which is this. Some years later, at a public subscription dinner raising funds for the Mercer Institute's second building, she was obliged to be introduced to the Marchioness of Bryce, who received her with a courtesy so complete, so graciously warm, and so entirely devoid of any flicker of recollection, that Lady Caverton spent the remainder of the evening uncertain whether she had been forgiven, or, which was infinitely worse, simply forgotten. If you ask me what this story is truly about, my dear friends, I will tell you it is about light, and about the world's long habit of confusing the light that falls on a woman with the woman herself. The supper room at Verne Hall looked at Lydia Mercer and saw a companion, because the light on her that evening was a borrowed gown and a borrowed carriage. An hour later, those same faces saw someone remarkable, because the light had shifted to a field marshal's arm. But she was the same woman in both lights. The same notebooks, the same East Camp, the same watch rotations done in the dark because someone had to do them. The room's error, the one Lady Caverton made loudly and 51 others made in silence, was to believe that the light was the woman. And the finest thing in this whole story, finer even than Lord Kingsley's question from the corridor door, is that Lydia knew the difference and refused to let even love blur it. She turned down the man she wanted rather than let the world file her away under his light. And he loved her enough to understand the refusal and to spend 2 years building her a light of her own. That is not stubbornness. Whatever the supper tables of this world choose to call it, that is a woman insisting on being real. And a love that can wait for a woman to be real, that can meet her there, on equal ground, and find her worth every year of the waiting, is the only love that, in my long experience of sitting beside fires and listening to the ends of stories, deserves the name at all. If you've been here with me tonight and you'd like a permanent seat beside this fire, the subscribe button for Moonlight at Marlowe is just below this video. It costs you nothing, and it means you never miss what comes next. There is always a next, and they are always worth the having. Good night, my dear friends. And the next time you see someone standing against a wall at a supper, wearing something quiet that you cannot quite account for, on someone the room has already decided doesn't belong, do look twice before you look away. There may be an Eastern camp behind it. A winter's worth of work done without witness, a name in a ledger that kept 50 people alive through the cold. There usually is.